Well, hello and welcome to our Rule of Life Toolbox Week 3. It's great to have Claire with us. She's going to be sharing with us some of her experiences as we begin to look at our third tool. But before we begin, Claire, how long have you been part of St. Mary's now?
I think David and I have been part of St. Mary's for about 5 years, something like that.
Okay,
We
great.
started coming when we had a grandson living with us. So it's about 5 years ago.
Wonderful. Been good so far?
It's been very good so far.
Brilliant.
Yeah, we felt we'd come home, actually. Yeah, I think that's...
Yeah, wonderful. I don't know, before that you were just saying you were you spent quite a bit of time in Oxford at St. Aldate's, and you became sort of a project manager there, and for a building project, and we are obviously at St. Mary's also undergoing a building project which requires a lot of giving. And your building project also required a lot of giving and generosity. And surprise, surprise, today we are looking at Christian generosity as part of our spiritual disciplines, as it were, the practice of generosity, and thinking a little bit about that. So it's great to have you with us, Claire, and to get some of your insight and experience on that. So I just suppose wondered if we could just kick off with the kind of core question of what is Christian generosity? Where does it come from?
Well, that's a big question. But I suppose essentially it comes from having a generous God. That's the model, isn't it? You know, you've got the generosity of God, the big picture, the creation picture, and then you've got the personal, the giving of his son, and Jesus giving his life for us, and all these. I mean, those are all the kind of spurs, if you like, or the big picture of what it means to be generous.
And I suppose then thinking from that, why is it important as Christians that we are generous and we think about what it means to be generous? We can talk about having such a great, generous God and be thankful for that, but then how does that impact us and how in the need for us to be generous, I suppose?
Well, I think as human beings, we're wired. If somebody's it's a two-way process. I think when you understand the generosity of God, you begin to think, well, I quite like to be like that too. That's my experience. That he draws the generosity out of you. So actually, in a way, it is his action. You have to respond, but it's coming from his heart. So you're beginning, well, speaking for myself, beginning to discover what God's heart is like. And then thinking, gosh, that's something I would quite like. I'd quite like to learn to have a generous heart too. So I suppose it sort of one follows the other.
In a sense of actually our ongoing discipleship of wanting to be more like God, created as part of our ongoing Christian journey. Yeah, absolutely.
Do
go hand in hand. Great. And I think one of the things that I've sometimes struggled with, and lots of people have, I think, is to think, how can we actually be generous? I mean, we think about giving money, and that's one way. Some people are in a position to be able to do that perhaps more easily than others. We've thought about tithing has been an ongoing biblical principle. But I wonder if you could just share with us the different ways that we become generous and how each of those things might be important in their own way.
Yeah. Well, yes, certainly the money. To go back to St. Aldate's, when we were there and we saw extraordinary generosity being poured out. In my case, before we reordered St. Aldate's, we had an extraordinary work of the Spirit. And in that period, I think the Lord really got hold of me on the money thing and identified my pathetic attitude to it, giving money. And Martha, in the very first of this series, talked about the trellis as a kind of visual aid of how we could cling to this thing called a trellis. Well, in my case, over money, it was there was a film with Tom Hanks in it called Forrest Gump that had come out in that period. It's about a boy who... Do you remember it? Yes.
Yeah, it's a very good film. Love it. Yeah.
Yeah, and he had to wear leg braces in order to learn to walk. And for me, that was a visual aid of what I needed to do on the money front: clamp on this giving thing, and just get on and do it, and stop faffing around. So that's the money, but that's the obvious one, isn't it? And another obvious one is a gift of time. We'll say to people, well, if you haven't got money, then you can give your time. And some people have got more time. I've got a lot more time. because I'm retired, so I've got a lot more time than others. But there are other fascinating things I think about developing a generous heart, which are perhaps a little more unusual. And I think one of them for me is developing what I would call a generous spirit. And by that I mean that most people are different from me, and I am often very critical of them. If they're not like me, I think, well, you're odd, aren't you? And so learning to understand different people and why they're different, and the stories they have that have shaped them and made them different, that's been a key thing for me in developing a generous spirit. So I don't expect, well, I've learnt not to expect that everybody would be wired like me. And now, of course, we have tools for that in terms of identifying personality types. But I think it's actually more, for me, it's been a discipline, a check. I check myself. If I find myself thinking, oh, this person's different from me and I'm feeling critical, I check and think, well, why are they different from me? There's probably a very good reason. And they're probably doing this thing that I find odd for all kinds of reasons that I don't understand.
Yeah.
So
sort of the generosity of accommodating for our differences.
Yes.
Willing to accept that and to work through that. Yeah.
Absolutely that. Absolutely that.
So we've talked about money, generosity of spirit. I suppose, what kind of, are there practical things that can sort of count as generosity? Might link in with time, but I don't know. Just doing a kind thing for someone.
Yes, well, time, certainly. I mean, I like the idea, I don't do it every day, but I do it some days of after talking to the Lord a bit, just saying, well, what do you want me to do with my time today? Because I got a lot of it. And we're all in this funny old lockdown thing where we can't do half the things we'd normally want to do with our time.
Yeah,
so it's a different challenge. I have a rather weird sense of humour, and I've spent a lot of time filling up boxes of rubbish for my grandchildren for their birthdays. And that's, I don't know if you call it generosity. Yeah, there are lots of creative ways of using our time, I think is what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember coming across at one point this idea of random acts of kindness as well, which
yes,
that's perhaps more accessible for some people who can do little bits here and often, which are very meaningful and touch people in different ways.
Yes, absolutely. Sending someone a card.
Yeah.
Telephoning somebody. Whatever prompts you. I think it's the thing that prompts you. You're prompted to do a certain thing.
Yeah.
And you grow in that, which is why it's a Christian discipline, because you grow in it. You get better. You get better at listening to yourself and better at listening to the Lord, I think, as you grow in it.
Great. So it sounds like you've got the resources on the one hand that you need to discern, to think, how can I be generous with this? And then you've got time, which encapsulates quite a lot of all the different ways that we can be creative. And it's a way of sort of looking to God to think, in what ways can I best do that? Or where are you calling me to do that? What I'm getting sensing. And at the start, when I said, what is Christian generosity? You really helpfully put it in within the narrative of the gospel, I suppose, God's giving to us and his son in salvation even, and all the good gifts that we can experience in those blessings, and then becoming generous, being a part of responding to that and becoming more like Christ. So I suppose coming full circle then, we've got these different ways that we can be generous, resources, time, etc. How can we, to coin the phrase that you sort of title this, developing a Christian heart, how can we develop our Christian heart? When we think about our spiritual practices, our disciplines, our prayer life, how can we become, what things can we do to find a more generous spirit, a more generous heart for the sake of those around us?
Well, that's a huge question, isn't it?
Yeah, sorry, I'm asking quite a lot of you. But...
I think the one other thing that I when I've reflected on this conversation before we started it, for me, in recent years, I think I felt the need to develop what I might call a generous attitude. So I grew up in a certain kind of framework where certain things were acceptable and other things weren't. And through the life I've lived, I mean, in our family, we've encountered a lot of, we've had a divorce, we've had mental health issues, we've had same-sex attraction, we've had addiction, a lot of things that are sort of outside the Christian narrative that I grew up in. You know, that you didn't. You know, I can remember when Billy Graham's wife came to England and she wore lipstick, and that was, you know, that's kind of, so it's so I think what I'm trying to say is that as I've lived my life, I've learned to think outside the box that I started in.
Okay.
In relation to other people, so that it's developing a generous attitude is the umbrella for that.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful to sort of set the whole thing up in it, really. And I wonder on the sort of, you know, it does get tricky. You mentioned before, you know, you felt you were pathetic in your attitude of giving, and I think we probably all go through times where we're not feeling particularly generous, or where we just sort of want to retreat to ourselves and not offer time or resource or whatever. What do you think? What do you do when you feel like that? Is there a way that you can try to move past that? I don't think it's a one-off graduation. You have to ongoing, you know, do that, don't you?
Absolutely. Well, it is. Before lockdown, I'm a regular swimmer normally, and I think it's the same principle as that. I go when I can go early in the morning, and I developed discipline of it. So I just got up and did it regardless of what I felt like. Yeah. Because I wanted to put the exercise into my life. It's the same principle, that you just do it regardless of how you're feeling. And sometimes you're not feeling that you want to do any of it. Yeah. You're just feeling you'd like to put the duvet over your head and make the day go away.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we do come into that place of really wanting to be generous, can you say something about perhaps the joy that it can be to be generous? You know, is it joy? Can it be joyful? Can it be enjoyable to be?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's where. So go back to what I've done in lockdown with my grandchildren. I've developed a habit of filling a box with things for their birthday. So I've got a grandson who was 15 a couple of weeks ago, and I feel that there's the wonderful 1066 and all that history of the British Isles, which is priceless, really. And I filled it with rubbish, and I got as much fun out of making that as he got in opening it when he eventually got it. So yeah, so what I'm saying by that is that it's your generosity can be shaped around you, the kind of person you are, what you like to do. So you bring joy. So you enjoy the generosity. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Great. And we can do that in different ways depending on sort of how we're wired, I suppose. Which makes,
exactly.
In some sense, all the more interesting, actually, doesn't it?
Yes.
Great. Good.
And then I suppose learning what other people, you know, other people might like being sent a box of chocolates or something, which I wouldn't particularly want to receive. So you do learn to give, but that gives pleasure too, if you know you're giving something to someone that they would like. Yeah. Great.
Well, I'm sure there's loads more, as you said, that we could say on generosity, but it's really helpful to hear from you, and to especially to think about what it means to have a spirit of generosity, both in what we can give physically in our time, but also in our attitudes to people. I think that's one thing that we often don't take stock of in our own self-awareness and how we view other people. So that's really helpful. So thank you very much, Clare. And I hope that those of you watching this have found that helpful, and at least something to ponder on and to think further and to pray into as you can continue your Christian journey. So thank you very much, Clare, and bless you in all that you do as well.